Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. It's a real pleasure. I know that there's a mix of academics and people from the professions here. My work, I get to do research on resilience all over the world, but I don't know about you, but I always still find that it comes down to whether or not an idea has any veracity, any truth in it, if it actually resonates with the children with whom I've actually worked over the years. A while back, I was referred a young woman who came to my office because she was, quote unquote, not going to school. And child welfare was involved, the school system was involved, and police were involved. Because she was known in the community as quite a delinquent young woman who wasn't going to school, and there were a lot of other problems. In fact, what I'd heard about her was that she was living in subsidized housing with her mother, and that they had been, she'd lived in great poverty for many years, and her mother had many men come through the house. Some of those men had physically abused the mother, and there had been sexual violence towards the girl herself and her younger sister. And over the years, by the time she got to about age 12, she'd become this fiercely aggressive girl, G-R-R-L-L-L sort of energy. And she would actually chase the men out of her house, out of her mother's bedroom, basically, with a knife to protect the family. Now, she was referred to me, and what caught my attention, this is not that different than the profiles of many of the young people I've worked with, but she came into my office, and she was carrying a newspaper, which in itself is incredibly weird. And on the front page of the local newspaper was the banner read, "Gangs Ruining Neighborhood." And she pointed at the newspaper because there on the front was a picture of her. She was all of 14 years old, and there was a picture of her and some of her friends sitting in front of the local 7-Eleven store. And I thought, this is very interesting. So I read to her, sort of the referral was that you don't go to school. And she was like, oh, she got indignant. She says, I go to school? Who told you I don't go to school? Well, you're the police, your child welfare worker, your teachers, So she says, I go to school sometimes. Sometimes. So I pause, I say, okay, explain this to me. And she says, well, I go to school sometimes to help one of my grade 8 English teacher. She's obviously in English class. And I said, well, how do you do that exactly? Like, it just didn't fit, right? And she says, well, sometimes she's a new teacher. She's very nice, but she absolutely sucks at getting the class to quiet down. I see. So how does that work for you? She says, well, sometimes, like for instance, the other day, she says, my teacher was trying to get the class to be quiet, and she goes, shh, shh, please put your cell phones away. Class, attention up here. She's like, Miss Honey or something from Matilda, like very, very gentle energy. Anyways, so I said, what did you do? In my office, she shows me, she literally jumps up on her chair in my office, puts her fingers between her mouth and says that this is what I did in the classroom. Can anyone do that whistle? Someone can do that whistle. Someone can do this whistle. Thank you. Except she did it better than that. She did it really loud, and then she shouted at her classroom, shut the fuck up! Now, you can imagine the reaction she got. And what was even more remarkable, I'm just like sitting there going, this is a really great story, I'm having fun. What happened next? And supposedly her teacher came over to her, looks up at her on the chair, and says, thank you. Isn't that amazing? And then afterwards, after class, she pulled the girl aside and said, next time you want to help me, please don't stand on the furniture and don't use the F word. Now, our intervention was super easy with this girl. She told me everything I needed to know, not necessarily about her pathology or her trauma, but she told me everything I needed to know about her resilience. She was looking to engage, to be a leader, to feel powerful. She was looking for a place, a cultural space, safety, and supports. And once we gave her all those things, she engaged back in school, and she engaged also in therapy for some of the trauma and the sexual violence that she'd experienced. But it began with inviting her to school not to become a student and learn, but to actually come back to school to become a peer mentor to the other children who'd been abused in the school. She was great. She knew every system. So the child who'd just been sexually or had a social worker or whatever, she became a great guide. Okay, don't talk to your social worker about that. Talk to her about this. Do this, do this. She knew how to game the system perfectly. And in that, she also found self-efficacy and a bunch of other things, which I'm going to go into here in a second, that actually help us understand the resilience of these kids rather than just focusing on the psychopathology. Now, what I'm learning from stories like that is that, in a sense, the problem with the theories of resilience is we're still highly individualizing when it comes to understanding why someone does well. And we're enamored with this kind of thinking. You know, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's done the fMRI scans on the Buddhist monks and proven that our brains we have incredible neuroplasticity and all this kind of stuff. And he says, you know, when I heard him speak, he says, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And we talk about resilience as if it's an inner concept, as if it's about us changing, about grit or something like that. And we completely forget that this is not true. Because fundamentally, it's a lot easier to learn to surf if you have a surfboard, a coach, and maybe a lifeguard. That most of the variance in the research models, if you actually look at what predicts outcomes that are positive in stressed populations, the vast majority of the predictive capacity of those studies is that it's the environment and not individual factors or personal change. So this, of course, brings me that we can, in fact, diagnose resilience. I know that's sort of somewhat oxymoronic or whatever. That is a bit odd, but you can, in fact, assess. Like, to understand resilience, you can use diagnostics in a sense. And this has been published in a journal, and you can look it up and everything else. I'm amazed they actually did publish it, but they did. First thing that we have to understand is resilience is not positive psychology, right? It is about our capacities when we are under stress. So the first thing you have to do is assess the severity, the chronicity of a person's stress exposures. You have to understand whether or not the stress occurs at one ecological level, such as an individual cognitive dysfunction or an atypical neurological functioning or whatever, or is it also in the environment? In other words, is it a child with an atypical sort of pattern of neurological functioning in a very wealthy, secure family, or is it a child living like the one I just talked about on that chair? We also need to know about attributions of causality. Do people blame themselves or others? And indeed, what are the cultures and what is the cultural and contextual factors that influence whether or not you perceive yourself at risk in the first place? So all of this, of course, what we're actually, if you look at the studies, you begin to see patterns. And one of the patterns is that in lower risk environments, Jon Kabat-Zinn and Oprah are actually quite right. Change yourself, and life gets better. But as risk increases, what we're actually understanding is that fundamentally we have to talk about the availability of resources, the accessibility of resources, the strategic use of resources. The girl had found a peer group that basically gave her a status other than an academic status, which was more fitting with the context in which she lived. She had exploited the resources that were nearest to her. She also received, I think, positive reinforcement of the strategies that she was using to survive in a very difficult context. And of course, the adaptive capacity in the environment was really quite low. There was very little that was being offered to her in that context to keep her safe, so she had figured out her own strategies. And that teacher, however, showed a great deal of adaptive capacity when she acknowledged the girl for what she had actually done. What's interesting, too, is in this model, we also have to account for temporal dimensions, socio-historical factors. How a person is resilient is always going to be dependent on the socio-historical period, the time, and their own developmental stages at which they are at. So that what you get is this constant flow between the environment and the individual strengths that will predict which protective factors are most likely to change their lives. Now, this is particularly important for us as people who create programs, design programs, because suddenly there is no absolute. There's a sense that the programs we want to build that will nurture resilience have to be highly sensitive to the culture and the context and the risk exposure of those we're trying to help. And thus we know that because of the science. Okay, now, first of all, you all know the story of Cinderella, of course, I'm assuming. But it's always held up as this incredible story of resilience, right? That she comes through great adversity. And by the way, I apologize for the image. This is the most popular image of Cinderella, of course, from Disney, though it has an incredible, sort of a racial bias in terms of her being pictured extremely white. And the second, of course, is a gendered bias in terms of how she's portrayed as a young woman. With my apologies to that, I did want to sort of present this as, let's think about the story of Cinderella. It's always talked about her capacity to overcome and, how good of heart she was and how nice she is to the little birdies in the basement and everything. She's just a great character, and then she has the right foot size for the glass slipper, and it's all so perfect, right? She comes out of great adversity and she gets the prince. This is the Meghan Markle story. It's a perfect story for that, right? It's also told, I think it's all wrong. The story should not be named Cinderella because really Cinderella has very little to do with her success. The entire story pivots on the fairy godmother. Think about the story without the fairy godmother. You have a child who's being raised in a kingdom without any social service net. This is an evil kingdom with a prince who spends all his money on gala balls, to decadent parties and everything else. But there's no mention of social workers, child welfare workers. There's no mention of this child is working in this home. She is a laboring child. And there's this kingdom has not been a signatory to the International Labor Organization's standards on the rights of the child, or the UN Convention, obviously, either. This is an evil kingdom like Arkansas or something like that. I don't know. Sorry to my American colleagues. Remove the fairy godmother, and you have a girl being raised, if she's like the children that I've worked with over the years in my practice, mostly street-involved youth, she gets to be 14, 15. She is fed up with the conditions that she is living in. She says to her stepmother, "Fuck you, I'm out of here." But she does not end up in the palace. This is the story without the fairy godmother. She ends up behind the palace, cold and hungry, swapping sex for favors, for a place to stay, for food. That tumbles into a pattern of other exploitation, drug addictions, etc., etc. You know the pattern and where this story ends. I've ruined the bedtime story, I know. But in some ways, if we recall here, and I say this carefully and with due respect, but Cinderella the princess or Cinderella the prostitute, those stories hinge on the fairy godmother. And in a sense, the way we develop programs and the way we design programs will say whether or not we are fairy godmothers or fairy godfathers, if you prefer. And thus, that is actually what the science of resilience is really about. So I use a practical definition of resilience in our work, not this capacity to overcome adversity, this highly individualized idea. But I think that when there is adversity, when we have exposure to adversity, resilience is our capacity to navigate to all those psychological, social, cultural, physical resources that we need to do well as our capacity to negotiate to get those things given to us in culturally meaningful ways. And there's really just two words you have to remember, especially if you're a program designer, researcher as well too, but I always find just remember the word navigation, that children need to navigate their way to what they need, and they also need to negotiate to be given those things in ways that make sense to them. Now, the guts of what we're finding in our research is I've produced several different lists reflecting the work that we've done all around the world. We have project sites in dozens of different countries. I work in a large collaboration. We've had millions, tens of millions of dollars now, over $10 million in funding. And we're beginning to see patterns in what predicts this capacity to overcome adversity. Now notice, I am not talking about diagnosing psychopathology. That's the other lecture you'll do. This is about what are the factors that are protective, that are sort of more common perhaps across cultures and contexts that children look for. Now, how these manifest is a negotiation with the culture, the context in which you live. But generally speaking, we see, when we look at our research across these different contexts all over the world, we see things like children like structure. They appreciate predictability, even if they rebel against it. They also appreciate consequences. They actually like the idea that they can have their problems. If they have a problem, they've transgressed or caused some issue, that then they can repair what they have done. Now think about this from a point of view of designing programs, of course. We are talking about the more of these things that you can build into a program, the more likely the program is to succeed, including such as parent-child connections. Now, this is horribly oversold, by the way, in our cultural space. We always say, oh, I get so fed up being on stage with people who will say, oh, if someone just loves you, you will be okay, which is a crock of shit. Because it's not true, and it's culturally biased to a particular space in the globe. And in fact, what we actually need often is a lot of other strong relationships, especially when the person who's supposed to love us, the one attachment that we have, if we define it that way, is usually the person who's also greatly under stress by the same stressors that the child is under. So we have dumped this responsibility on a parent to heal and to be everything to their child, which is a ridiculous thing that most cultures around this world would never do. They would instead diversify to say that we need lots of strong relationships. We need coaches and social workers, teachers. We need a whole bunch of people to help us. We also need a powerful identity, something that we can, in a sense, strut, that we can be powerful about, something we can assert to others. We also need a sense of control in our lives. We need a sense of belonging, spirituality, a sense that our life has some sort of purpose. We need rights and responsibilities, genuine social justice, access to responsibilities as well, things that people can count on us for, and generally safety and support. Now, what's interesting about this is that the programs that give more of these things tend to be more effective. And so, for instance, if someone comes to me and says, I'm going to offer a self-esteem workshop for girls, I go, oh, for frig's sake, how boring and how likely to fail. But if you say you're going to offer a self-esteem workshop for girls, and that on March 8th you're going to use that as a catalyst to popularize the idea of women's rights, and you're going to get those girls to create social networks amongst themselves, and the self-esteem is going to take a secondary space to, say, social justice issues and empowerment, and there's going to be discussions about the Me Too movement, and Black Lives Matter, perhaps, if there's diversity in the group. And we begin to sort of introduce within that a more broader sense of access to powerful identities and a performance. So these girls leave the group and they do something that merits self-esteem in their school or their broader community and with their families. Now, I know that your project will work. Because that is actually what the science says. That as you begin to tick more of these boxes in our program design, the more likely your program is to produce long-term, sustainable outcomes, both psychological and psychosocial, basically. Now, if I might, actually, sorry, I'm going to go back here. Let me do this. I want to show you this rather than just talk about it. We do research. One of the ways that we do research, we use a lot of mixed method designs. But one of the ways we do is we do something called a day in the life. And we film children all over the world who are resilient, who demonstrate an exceptional capacity to do better than we ever would have expected in the context in which they live. And we've done this in many different places and spaces and countries. And one of the children we filmed for a day, literally from when he got out of bed in the morning to when he went to bed at night, was an Indigenous youth living off reserve in Western Canada. And he had been apprehended by the child welfare system when he was 3 years old and placed in a foster home. We met him when he was 15 years old. And he was referred to the study because he was actually in school, performing well, wasn't using drugs, and seemed to be reasonably mentally healthy, which, as you know, for many of the youth that fit that profile, that is not the case. So we were curious to see how he was maintaining himself, and we literally put a camera on him all day long. Now, just so you know, there's a lot of ethics behind what you're about to see. I have permission to show this. It's a very participatory process with the youth themselves in which they select the clips that you see, et cetera, et cetera. Also, by the way, I don't go in and do the filming of this. I mean, can you imagine me following a 14-year-old girl around the community with a camera all day? I mean, I'd be arrested, right? So, we get, researchers from the communities often. They look like, there's a certain, of the community. We do it all kinds of ways that the kids are protected indeed. But I just want to show you a brief clip, about a minute of this child's life. What he did, though, was leave his foster home, walk across town on a Saturday, and go and spend time with his extended family, who lived also in the city where he was being placed, off reserve. Now that's kind of cool, right? He does all this childcare with the children. You're going to see him with his nephews and cousins. He's with his cousins and his nephews and nieces, and he's doing childcare. He has a genuine contribution. He's connected to his culture. He's connected to his extended family. This is really good. Oh, and by the way, the house he goes to happens to be where they sell a lot of drugs and run guns. It's known to be a place where gangs hang out. So we did not know this when we sent our research team in. that young fellow is not putting on an act. We have a lot of hours of him doing these kinds of things. He's obviously very comfortable with that child. And when you begin to think about less of the dangers that he exposes himself in that home, and more about resilience, you think about he has navigated his way to a set of resources which are supporting everything that we wish for that particular child. But because we as a system, as fairy godmothers, we have failed to give him access to those same things, he has creatively created it for themselves. How many of the indigenous children that we have in our system, who unfortunately do not have great outcomes, find the same 9 resources that that young man just found? He has structure. Someone's relying on him. He is connected to his culture. He has a strong, powerful identity as someone who's valued and matters. He is basically checking these things off. And that, for me, becomes very interesting. By the way, I've left some of these cards at the back. If you want to sort of, I find people will take something like this from a talk. They won't take, the slides and stuff, but they'll take something like that if you want to put that up on your wall. And if you want to read more about this, there is a book called I Still Love You. And it talks about families going through basically therapy, exploring and finding these 9 things. But to have some fun with this, I just feel like, can you think about a child like the girl on the chair or the boy I've just talked about? Can you think of a particular child in your practice right now? And I want to give you a little test to see how resilient they might be. So, structure. Can your child, the child that you're thinking of, complete these sentences? Could they say, there are people in my life who expect me to blank? We don't give children in foster care very much expectations, not beyond cleaning their room and stuff. Nobody really needs them. Next one, when I don't meet expectations, I know that blank will happen. That's a predictable environment and that they can solve their own problems. What about, I can reach out to my blank to get help when I need it. In other words, are there resources out there for them? Are they connected to a community of relationships? I feel respected for what is special about me when I'm with or at or doing. Is that actually part of their lives? In my blank, I get to participate in making decisions that affect my blank. Or at my blank, people miss me when I'm not there. Can their child that you're thinking of, that you're worried about, actually complete those sentences? Sense of culture. There are places such as blank that I can celebrate my culture and my beliefs. When I'm with others at my blank, I feel treated fairly. Very, very important part of resilience. When I'm with blank, I am responsible for myself or others. I am well cared for by, and I feel safe when I'm with or at. And what we're finding is that as you increase the answers to that, you will likely create more capacity to resist stressors and actually have a measure of psychosocial well-being in contexts that are greatly dysfunctional. Now, that's a fun clinical version, because I knew that there would be some clinicians, and I know you've been hearing a lot of science in the last day or so, so I thought I'd bring that version of it. But if you want to do more of a research-oriented thing, there is a measure called the Child and Youth Resilience Measure. We've developed it over the past 12 years. It's been used most recently in Jordan with Syrian refugees. It's translated into more than a dozen languages, including French. It's on the website. It's free. Feel free to use it for anything that you see, either clinically or for evaluations or research. But I guess what I'm kind of beginning to understand, though, is when you begin to think like this, then you begin to think about services and supports. And how can you develop, how can services and supports indeed make children more resilient? One of the other tools we've been developing is a service use satisfaction, which is kind of inspired by this kind of thinking. So I also wanted to bring you another tool. Here's some other questions for you. Now, you just thought about that child and whether or not they had the resources they needed to survive and thrive. Now I'd like you to think about a child that has fired you. You must have one. Somebody tell me that some child that you're working with has resisted intervention from you. Not just me, I have that experience. Other people have that experience as well, I take it, right? Good. Thank you. That's very reassuring for my self-esteem that I'm not the only one who's ever been fired by a client. Here are some questions that we tend to ask as part of our evaluations. So, like, overall, would the child say yes or no to these questions? Overall, I am satisfied with the services I received. Because we, to be fairy godmothers and fairy godfathers and get kids those 9 things which I talked about, we have to basically match, we have to be relevant to them. So overall, I'm satisfied with the services I received. Would a child say that? I helped choose my services. Would the child say that as well? Would the child say I had a say in how the service was delivered to me and could ask for what I wanted? Even if it's a mandated service, a child welfare service, a forced placement, there's always somewhere in that decision-making tree that we can still help the child answer these questions positively. I received services that were right for me, whether that's culturally or otherwise. I could get the service when I needed it. This was the service that I needed. Staff respected my religious and spiritual beliefs. Staff spoke in a way that I understood, and staff were sensitive to my cultural and my ethnic background. And indeed, when you can get children answering those questions affirmatively, our experience is that they actually are more likely to take advantage of the services that they need, because quantitatively, when we run these kinds of big quantitative surveys, multiple country studies. This is data from a 5-country study, eventually with 7,000 kids. The data you're actually looking at is just the Canadian data with about just under 500 children, all of them using services, multiple services in fact. That was one of the selection criteria, that these children had access to multiple services or were using multiple social and mental health services, school-based services, this type of thing. And interestingly, when we actually ran all this, we began to find some interesting patterns to these children's lives. So what we found, in fact, was that this service use experience that I just gave you, that measure, was particularly important, because what it did was it said, first of all, that children, if you look on the very far side, you'll see that it says contextual risk. And then we have individual risk factors, service use experience, and lifetime service use accumulation, or the number of services that the child uses. 4 different domains of inquiry in this study. Now, what we found was, interestingly, that a child at more contextual risk, living in more dangerous communities, actually did not receive more services over their lifetime. Isn't that weird? Like, you think the kids in the most dangerous environments would get more services, but we all know that's not true. The other thing we found, that even when the child lives in a dangerous environment and gets a service, you know those 9 questions I just gave you on the service use experience? They scored lower. They said they hated the services from all of us that they got. Now that's kind of disappointing. The other thing we began to discover, however, was that when children had a good service use experience, their resilience scores actually went up. In other words, if they can answer yes to those questions that I just gave you, their resilience scores rises, and then they change their functional behaviors. They stay in school, like the girl. They don't use as much drugs. They are not as, they don't engage in high-risk sexual activities as much. So you see a definite pattern here in which we can modify our services to bolster the resilience by giving children access to those 9 things I've been talking about: structure, consequences, positive identity, sense of their culture, belonging, all these other things. And that through that changes their outcomes, their actual behaviors. The girl on the chair came to school, participated in a peer mentorship program, felt powerful, and then occasionally sat in a classroom and read a book or whatever. So, I mean, these are, just kind of jumped through those, just kind of basically gave you these lessons that we've actually learned. But the trick here is essentially, probably the most important lesson, that more services are not necessarily better for children. We don't want to swamp children with services. What we want to do is provide them with services that bolster resilience by giving them opportunities to answer those questions. Yes, I like the services I get, and I have ability to negotiate with you as my fairy godmothers and fairies and fairfathers, to negotiate with you to get what I need. Now, there is a little bit of a fly in the ointment here. As we've moved on with some of this research, I wanted to bring you something a little bit novel and new. And what we're actually discussing is that it's more complicated than just that. What we're actually doing now, and I've been writing about this extensively in journals like Neglect and British Journal of Social Work, et cetera, is that a resource can actually have a positive or negative impact at lower levels of risk exposure, but a negative or positive impact at higher levels of risk. Now this is, okay, let me show you rather than tell you what this means, because it gets a little bit wordy. Look, There was an interesting study. I was guest editing Child Neglect, a special issue on this idea of positive impact. And in a study by Kwok and his colleagues, what they did was they looked at depressive symptoms for children who had been different profiles of abuse. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, et cetera, right? Multiple forms of abuse, et cetera. And interesting, when they looked at the depressive symptoms, no surprise, the children actually who had been neglected, when they were exposed to mentorship groups, you know, like where there's an adult in a choir or a boys and girls club, like there's an adult helping a group of kids do an activity. When they experienced that, they actually decreased over time their depression. Yay, it's exactly what you think, right? You've designed the perfect program, you take a bow, it works. Except that children who were sexually abused became worse. The children, this is the differential impact. And if you don't go looking for this as researchers or as clinicians, you will miss this. Because the sum total aggregate data said the children got better. But when you disaggregated the data, the children who'd been sexually abused got worse in depression as a consequence of being in a group that was supposed to help them. Really interesting is when you looked at patterns of delinquency, it was the kids who'd been sexually abused. They actually got, the children who'd been sexually abused, they were becoming less delinquent. They were becoming less delinquent. But the children who had been experiencing emotional violence and emotional neglect, they became more delinquent because of their intervention. Now, this is the kind of patterns which I really think we need to begin to, actually I'll go back, which we really need to begin to ask, because if you're designing programs, we need to start thinking about which effective processes count most in which context, at what level of risk exposure to people from which culture. And when we do, we get these nuanced patterns that are particularly poignant in terms of what we know. I think I want to show you this a little bit. I know it'll take you about a little bit of time, but I do think this is fundamentally important to designing programs. In that when we begin to think about, imagine the top line is a child who just has advantages in life, and that's the optimal developmental curve. If you, say, had something happen, this vertical line that cuts through it, say you give that child piano lessons, a soccer team, or whatever, right? Well, it helps them a little bit because they have so many other resources. But imagine a child in that little dashed line. Maybe they have just a few problems in life. And you give them an intervention like access to a recreational sport. Well, the advantage it gives them is the A. They get a little bit of benefit. But what we know from the science on this is if you give children who are extremely disadvantaged, that bottom line, children who have very few resources, and you give them something like a recreational program, the amount of variance that is accounted for, the amount of change you impact on their lives is huge, is the B. In other words, you have the most impact on the children who are most disadvantaged. And that is such an important principle for designing programs. Let me go on here. If I could, can you imagine a situation, though, like this, where an intervention helps children who are at very little risk, but actually harm children who are at lower levels of risk. And the intervention is like taking them to jail and scaring them with going to jail. A child who's relatively well-resourced and secure will go to jail and go, oh my God, this is really scary, I don't ever want to be up here, right? The child who comes out of a highly crime-oriented family, it's a badge of courage. They walk around going, you effing kidding. This is the best you can do for punishment? Well, I could walk through here in a day. It has an iatrogenic effect. And if I could, there's also this pattern where actually something that benefits a child at the lowest, like the most at risk, can harm a child that's less at risk. And of course, foster placement is an excellent example, and I've published some of this as well. You put a child who does not perceive themselves in danger in their home family, and you put them in foster care, they will get worse. A child who understands that their mother and father are seriously addicted to substances, that there's severe violence in the home and they are in danger, and you put them into foster care, they will take advantage of that situation. Not always, but many children will take advantage of that and understand that's where they have to be. So in a sense, what I'm getting at here is this kind of complexity. And I leave you with this idea that really what we want to do is we want to design better programs that help people develop resilience. And this called What Works is available also for free. I seem to be giving everything away today. We also put all this stuff up on our website. Go to the website. This can be downloaded. It's a wonderful manual that they just wrote that's trying to get these principles in terms of design of programs. Now, I don't quite have time to go through this example. I brought lots of different examples for you because I think the questions might be more interesting. But I did want to leave you with one last image in terms of if we're going to think about resilience in children. We've been doing this research all around the world to try and figure out what it is that makes children resilient. One of the places we did that research years ago was in Tanzania. That's actually where some of those questions, some of these ideas come from. And when I was in Tanzania working with my colleagues there in collaboration, my daughter at that time, she's now in her early 20s, she came with me. And she went to school one day with some of the children of my colleagues. And I went back at lunch hour and I snapped this photo. By the way, if you can't pick out my daughter, she is the fifth one. You never know. In all seriousness, I love this photo because my daughter is outnumbered on that bench. We know a lot about the patterns that predict her resilience. We don't know very much about the resilience of other children on that bench. We don't know about children here in Canada. We don't know much about the Syrian refugees who have recently arrived. We don't know much about our indigenous populations here. We don't know about African Nova Scotians. We don't know about people with children with disabilities. We have vast chasms in our thinking because most of the science has not reached well in those communities. And if I could inspire you as researchers and as communities, we need to still continue to ask what it is that is a protective factor in a particular context, in a particular culture, that will actually help a particular child do better than we can ever expect. So on that note, I'd like to simply say thank you for the invitation, un grand merci, and the questions will be welcome. Thank you very much.